I'm here today in Finland taking Teaching Climate Together internationally. My name is Isaias Hernandez.
And I am Dr. Panu Pihkala.
And this
This
is
is Teaching Climate Together.
We are here today with Dr. Panu Pihkala here at the University of Helsinki. Dr. Panu Pihkala is a researcher and professor that studies the emotional, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of climate change. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Warmly welcome to Finland.
Thank you. I kind of want to learn more about who you are and if you want to kind of give more of an introduction to yourself and your work.
Yes, so I was born in Finland, 1979, and Finland was a very safe place to grow up. So I was privileged in that way, and I have a long history of going outdoors, on family trips, and so that has affected my relationship with the more than human world. Actually, in the town where I was living, there was a sort of environmental/social justice issue in the 1980s because the groundwater, which is usually very safe and pure in Finland, was contaminated by a leak from a local sawmill. So when I was a kid, I got to learn that there are these kinds of issues, but it didn't cause any massive anxiety on me or anything like that. And it was only in my university years at this very institution, University of Helsinki, when I got to learn more about global issues and environmental issues. And that led me to do environmental education and working with religious communities and environmental issues, and eventually also to the eco-emotion work.
I love the intersections of how you fell in love with the environment, is that there was a certain issue that you were concerned by, and that's something that we all share, water, right? That's a living system that nourishes our bodies. And I think academic institutions really place those inspirations for a lot of young people to start questioning about things. I'm very curious around the term climate emotions, because that is something that is very new in recent years. And as someone that has really kind of talked about emotions and through an individualism lens, I never really understood what climate emotions are. So can you share more about what climate emotions are?
In the Finnish language, we have a word tunne, which covers both feeling and emotion. And if something feels like something, we say tuntuu as a verb. So I grew up in a culture and language which doesn't separate between conscious or not so conscious emotions and feelings, for example. And that has slightly affected me, of course, in relation to emotions related to environmental issues. So I think the broad term would be something like environmental emotions or earth emotions, as Glenn Albrecht calls it, or eco-emotions. So basically there can be all kinds of environmental issues which cause different emotions or combinations of emotions. And it can happen together between people. Both humans and other animals may be shocked by environmental changes. So climate emotions then is emotions which are significantly impacted by climate issues. And people's lives are complex, as you have often talked about in your work, and many kinds of things can affect what we are feeling on a given day and given moment. For example, if you are suffering from multiple injustices, it may be that disappointment, frustration, anger, they are very understandable and important emotional reactions. And in some other contexts, it might be a slightly different array. And that's related to the discussion that what are the best climate emotions. And I think we need to be very critical of those discourses because people's situations are so different. But it's been very important, I think, to give recognition and validation to the fact that climate crisis issues cause quite deep emotions, sometimes difficult emotions. And that kind of practical need has been at the heart of my work.
Yeah, I really love how you phrased it in a way that it's not so much about humans, but also how non-human species from the flora, fauna, fungi, and also the organisms are all interconnected, and they also are affecting and also grieving in certain ways, whether that's habitat loss, whether that was the displacement, the extinctions of species. Those are real events that are happening around us. But I really love how you talk about the broader spectrum of how we talk about climate emotions is about the individual human with relationship to the climate crisis, because the first time I heard a word around climate emotions was eco-anxiety. And I was 20 years old and I was at university, and I remember a professor said, you know, a lot of people have climate anxiety. And I laughed. And I laughed because I said, what the heck is that? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean you have anxiety about the planet? And at the time, I didn't realize how disvalidating that was to my peers, to my professors, to myself, because I had thought, what do you mean people, I don't fear of this planet when I can't even afford my bills, I can't afford food, I can't afford these resources. But then I said, those conditions and those issues that I'm currently facing are also a symptom of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
You know, in your work, you've covered these emotionals and these terminologies. How have you seen them being popularized in the last few years?
Yeah, thanks a lot for all that. That's profound stuff, I think. And one part of the practical skills we need, both as individuals and communities, is dealing with things where we have either failed or we haven't been as good as we would have liked to be. Yeah. So what you say reminds me of this need for self-compassion and self-forgiveness also. So, and of course, it's a learning experience, and I know that later on you have been validating lots of people's eco-anxiety, but thanks for sharing that experience. My public work on eco-anxiety and eco-emotions really got more popular in Finland in 2017. I published a popular science book around eco-anxiety and hope, and many people started to read it. There was quite a lot of media coverage and then lots of speaking engagements in Finland and so on. And the learning process also for me in many ways, and one of the most important dimensions of that was learning about different people's emotional experiences, because there's such a wide variety of them. And this issue of what do we actually mean by anxiety and the ecological crisis, that was really in the heart of lots of those discussions.
The ways in which language is so important, and like you mentioned here in Finland, like the rich culture of being able to have these sacred words in your native language, and how that's also really the ways in which our dominant language here in English, for example, really loses that essence. As someone that grew up in a multicultural household, trying to find words in English to match the words in Spanish or in other languages, sometimes it doesn't signify nor kind of gives it the grace that's trying to explain and illustrate the whole term. Within your work, 2017, and even though you've been doing this for decades, you talked about your taxonomy of climate emotions and other climate emotions models that you created. I'm very interested if you want to talk more and share more about those processes and frameworks to create it.
After this first book of mine about eco-anxiety and hope, I had written some books before, but that was more about environmental education. Then I began writing a second book which included a broader array of emotions and feelings around ecological issues. So that was published in Finland in 2019, and it was that research process which then led me to write an English article called Toward a Taxonomy of Climate Emotions. And later on it partly influenced the creation of the Climate Emotions Wheel, where I cooperated with Climate Mental Health Network. So I'm trying to avoid those cultural and social norms where we would label some emotions as bad and some as good. Of course, there's certain manifestations where we can do ethical evaluation. So part of my work has been to give recognition to the nuances and different manifestations of emotions. And then visualizations like the Climate Emotions Wheel are helpful for people to realize that, hey, there's many of these. Although these models are never perfect and cannot include everything, they can at least help people to start to engage.
The climate emotions wheel scale that you created, like it's a lot of emotions that people can easily identify with. We've all felt angry, we've all felt sad, we've all felt despair. And I love the dichotomy that you talk about, how emotions do not exist in singular ways. They exist in multiple ways. Of course, that, you know, when we look at it as humans, right, it's easy for us to say this is negative, this is positive. But what you're saying is that there's different modalities in which those emotions exist and how they can be applied to unpack the injustices or the pain that the individuals are feeling. It's not so much the medical tool that will fix the climate crisis or an individual, but it's a way for individuals to compartmentalize and process it in a way that validates them and doesn't make them assume that there's something unnatural about them thinking about this. We're going to actually become student teacher here, and I'm going to be learning about this model right now.
Okay, so the process model of eco-anxiety and ecological grief. I'll just write process here. So this was the result of a long interdisciplinary research process where I was trying to create a simplistic but still nuanced model of what roughly may happen when people engage with the ecological state of the world. And so there's two kinds of things here. There's a chronological dimension and more thematic dimensions. Yeah. And I'm just gonna do a rather simple drawings here. So if we use just circles, so first there's unknowing. There's a period when you simply don't know about the ecological state of the world, and of course people's situations are very, very different, as you well know. And small children may be affected by climate crisis, for example, but the level of consciousness is here what causes this distinction between unknowing and here what I'm calling semi-consciousness. So I'm partly using terms created by eco-psychologists Linda Basel and Sarah Edwards in a 2009 roughly article, and semi-consciousness is one of those which they are also using. So it's when you know something already, but you don't know very much, or the whole of it. Of course, you can never know completely all of it, and it may be complex in the sense that you might not want to know more. So I think this is where we see lots of people reacting that, hey, if I start to take in more of this information, that would actually require me to change my life ways, and do I want to do that? Perhaps not, so I try to keep a distance. And what happens next, possibly, in the model is called awakening, somehow here, and it's quite complex, because people may accept part of the information, but not all of it, and some people may try to do a sort of detour. Oh, I don't really want to know this. I'll try not to know it. And people's journeys are very different. For me, for example, I would say that I was sort of in semi-consciousness until I was 20. I knew about many environmental issues and environmental justice issues also, but the fuller knowledge of how serious the ecological crisis is, I didn't get it until I went to the university. But now when I think of children even in Finland, this happens sometimes when you are 6 or 7 for many kids.
So they're already, like, young people already like kind of accepting this type of awakening. Because I kind of the same with you, that I knew about environmental issues, I knew about global warming, then it changed to climate change as I got older. And then in the university, it was climate crisis. And that's where I had my more awakening of, like, this is actually more severe than I actually thought and what I had learned as a young person. Like, I knew it was real, but I didn't know how severely bad it was.
Often we see right now girls who are roughly 11 going more to what I mean by awakening here, that they are sort of then realizing more about the actual severity, and things are changing. So, but I'm including shock here because it can be quite shocking to learn to know more. And in education, sometimes this may happen, for example, that a teacher shows an environmental documentary with good intentions, but the content may be so shocking that the kids are actually getting very scared, and I think that's one of the ethical challenges for education. So how to sort of facilitate young people knowing more without traumatizing them at the worst case.
So like it's not so much that they don't care, it's more that they've been exposed to the truth and don't know how to process that anymore. And sometimes with shock, they then, you're saying they move back here.
Yeah. And then we come to the heart of the model, which I'm calling coping and changing. So, and it has three dimensions, and there is sort of overlap between them. And I'll just write letters here and soon explain what they are. And then there's a background terrain around this. One could do a circle here also. As you can see, I'm not really a graphic artist. Music is more my thing. But based on different kinds of studies in psychology and sociology and spirituality and you name it, it seems that people need elements from three major dimensions in order to what is called adjust and transform. So the situation in the world, the sort of eco-social crisis, requires us to adjust but also to transform. And this is something which we feel a lot in Finland because we are a rather rich country globally considering also a small country, but people realize that we need to do our part and there are some attitudes or even parts of worldview which need to be changed. And so this is action, grieving, including other emotional engagement, and distancing, including both self-care and avoidance. And then the idea is that if you do any one of these overly strongly, then you end up more to the direction of this background space of stronger anxiety or depressive moods or burnout, for example. So classic example is young people who very bravely start to do a lot of climate activism, but they don't find enough possibilities to rest, to keep a sort of healthy distance, practice self-care, community care, it's not just individualistic, and then they end up more in the danger of burnout.
I love that you said this because I used to be involved in a lot of frontline activism as a college student, and I remember in youth activist spaces, it's sometimes a bit sacrificial mindset of we need to keep going, we need to be stronger, you need to show up here. And there was times where I was dealing with own personal family issues, relationship issues in life, and I felt that I had to sacrifice parts of those moments of my life, of my own humanity, because I thought I have to care more about the earth. But then through that, I lost a lot of my self-care that practices and my relationship of how do I make this sustainable in my work.
Thanks for sharing that, and that's a powerful example of also one could, for example, put here arrows indicating that there's lots of other factors always affecting people's journeys. One term in research is socio-ecological modeling, which means that there's social and ecological and all kinds of factors which affect people. For example, like you say, what's the family situation?
Yeah.
And what's going on in the country where you are living? Is there any sort of mental space for environmental matters if there's, for example, almost a civil war going on? And I think we need to realize that it's very intersectional and complex. And how did you find a way out of that situation, by the way, where you realized that this is driving me to do too much?
I think I had to really evaluate my relationships with some of the people. It's not to say all activists think the same, but there's certain principles that when you're younger, you tend to have a more absolute mindset. And I think that I had to realize that at the end of the day, my body and my health are important to me, and I can never get my health back. and I'm the only one that has control of my body, my soul, my work. And if I can't take care of that, then I'm susceptible to letting people run over me and tell me that I'm doing this for the greater good. But I think I had to reevaluate friendships in the movement while also putting boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's very, very profound, and it connects in the model with the sort of distancing slash self-care element. Also, I think with emotional dimension, because I hear that you learn to work with those feelings of not doing enough.
Yeah.
And a sort of reframing that hey, I'm doing a lot already, and I have the right also to think about my own well-being. People have been trying to learn ways to deal with the sadness and complicated emotions. And that may be combinations of sadness and guilt or feelings of inadequacy and that sort of thing. And that's a positive development in Finland, that we have now much more communal opportunities to do that than we had in 2018. It's still not mainstream, I'm not saying that, but many NGOs, for example, have incorporated that and built social norms which allow people to take breaks, as you say. So it's very important that the community also would give you the permission or even encourage you to do that. And also if there's encouragement that it's normal to feel sadness, and you know, as embodied beings, we need to all give that attention also. For some people it may be lighting a candle, some people like to build some kind of memorial, or then discuss about sad feelings at a climate cafe, so it can mean many things.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways in which humans process grief, and I think that's where the spiritual side of also your work and also my work of kind of talking about this need of spirituality, and not so much identifying with a religion, but more about this belief and practice that spirituality can also exist within, like talking to the land, making sure you water your garden. Like these are types of practices that are sacred. And do you feel that, in other countries, let's say like America, for example, that's very known for consumer society, a bit negligent on its mental health crisis that we're having right now. Do you think there's more of that spiritual side here in Finland from younger people?
That's a very good question, and it's been a while since I traveled in North America, so it's also
thank
difficult.
God.
Yeah, exactly, for me. And so it's difficult to compare. And like you, I tend to think of spirituality as having a relationship with something larger than yourself, that as a broad denominator. And I think it's very important if it happens through embodied somatic connections. And luckily we have elements of that in Finland, but I'm a bit cautious to say whether there's more, because there's so influential countercultural movements in the States also in relation to that. So in relation to grief, if you only do that and you don't get rest from it and you don't get feelings of efficacy from action, then there's more of the danger of getting into stronger depressive moods. And if you only do distancing, there's going to be so-called cognitive dissonance or affective dissonance, that you partly feel that something is not right when I compare my actions with the state of the world. And other people are, saying that there should be more sustainability. And so there may be psychological conflicts also if you just do distancing. And so the adjust and transform part then leads to a second circle in the model, which is called Living with the Climate Crisis. And just very briefly, it has the same three elements, but the subtitles have changed in two of them. So in the grief part, there is then now emotional engagement, including grieving. And then in the distancing part, it's now self-care, probably understood, not just individualistic, and in brackets, sometimes avoidance. And there's action. And that reflects that it's possible to reach a state, at least temporarily, where there's more consciousness and flexibility. So it's not so that, hey, now I have to run away from this knowledge because it's too much. But you may, for example, start to notice that, hey, now it's starting to be too much. Okay, what can I do? going outdoors and breathing has helped me before.
Yeah.
So there's more consciousness and flexibility.
We talked about climate emotions and the need to talk about it and how we express it. And you created the climate emotions wheel. And I want to learn more about your thought process behind it and why you created it.
Thanks for asking. And Climate Emotions Wheel came out in 2023 by Climate Mental Health Network.
Yeah. Very recent.
Yeah, it's very, very recent, and Anja Kamenets and some others were working heavily on it and invited me to join because my research on taxonomy of climate emotions was much used in the process. We have a selection of emotions that are relatively common in relation to climate matters. But for example, if you think about the climate crisis, what are some of the emotions that come into your mind, like intuitively? So?
Anger,
Yeah.
happiness,
Yeah.
sadness,
Yeah.
and confusion.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Can you say more about the happiness part?
Yeah, I think the happiness part is moments of when I come together in spaces with people, or knowing that I'm not alone doing this work has kept me alive and also happy to see my friends.
Okay, that's wonderful to hear. And in the climate emotion wheel, that should be we. So there's a segment which is called positivity, and then there's different emotions there. I'm not going to write them, but there's, for example, empowerment and gratitude for others who are also trying to do many things for the climate. There's interest. So what you say resonates strongly with that. You also mentioned anger, and that's one segment in the climate emotions wheel also. So, what kinds of anger about climate matters have you encountered actually personally?
Despair,
Yeah.
not knowing what's going to happen, but also fury.
Yeah.
I describe fury as not so much a violent process, but as a power structure for individuals to tap into, to understand the fire that keeps them going. And sometimes fury is part of that.
Yeah. That's why I think very similarly, and the Finnish word vimma I'd be using here around here for that good kind of fury. And also in the climate emotions wheel, there's moral outrage, indignation, those constructive anger types, which are very important. There is also frustration mentioned, and feelings of disappointment and betrayal, which are closely related to anger. They are not exactly the same emotion, but I was part in 2021 of doing this large international survey on young people and climate emotions and their attitudes towards governments. And there we found, together with Hickman and Marx and others, that a lot of young people are experiencing disappointment or even betrayal because...
Institutional betrayal.
Institutional betrayal, exactly. Yeah. And here the wheel has a fear segment, and here it has a sadness segment. And what's important about the wheel is that we are not saying that these are the all possible emotions, and we are not saying that what is the exact relation between them. People can have profoundly different combinations of what they are feeling, and also the words that are in the middle. So they give some impression of what is there. But in the sadness section, we have, for example, guilt and shame here, and they could be thought about emotions of their own. So what I'm saying is that the wheel luckily has been very useful for lots of people, but it shouldn't be taken too literally. So, for example, that guilt would always be a part of sadness. We are not saying that, but we are implying that often there is both sadness and guilt in people's minds about climate crisis.
So these are the main four common pillars, but then you have these exterior emotions and behaviors and characteristics.
Exactly so. And for example, one could easily do versions of your own. And you mentioned confusion. I think that's a very prominent climate emotion. Yeah. And in the Climate Mental Health Network website, you can find empty wheels, so people can fill it in different events or educational settings, for example. There's an emoji version also. And now in May 2024, there was published a guide to climate emotions that I wrote there together with comments from Anja Kamenets. And it has reflection questions about the emotions and also brief text about the dynamics, because as you say, they can happen in connection with each other. There may be emotions about emotions and that sort of thing.
When young people approach you about this diagram, I think sometimes we want an answer, right? We were saying, this is what's going to help my eco-anxiety. This is what's going to fix something. But I think what you're saying is that this diagram is more for individuals, groups, organizations to contextualize these emotions.
Yes, and we know from emotion research that if you are able to name the emotion, at least roughly, then it's much easier to work constructively with the energy in that emotion. So for many people it may be that there's a different blend of difficult emotions and feelings, but it may be challenging, especially if you haven't been given emotion literacy or emotion-related education to observe that what are you actually feeling. And then when you realize that, hey, this situation actually makes me feel guilt, then it's easier to think about, okay, how could I then work with this guilt? But if it's part of a sort of vague, difficult feeling, it may be more tricky to work with it.
Interesting. I didn't think about it that way, and I think that's how people are able to find that avenue of change for themselves. And do you think that when you're teaching students this at a university level, what are some of the responses that you've gotten?
Yeah, we actually have here an open book, which is quite recent, Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, How to Teach in a Burning World, edited by Jennifer Atkinson and Sarah Jacquet-Ray. I have a chapter showing the climate emotions wheel. Then people write in the middle, for example, environmental crisis or climate crisis, and then start writing emotion words that they themselves feel in their own language, preferably. And that kind of activity I've often done in education, both with young people and adults. And it's really interesting that almost always a couple of people say that I was surprised, that I hadn't realized that I'm feeling also this in relation to climate matters.
Yeah, because I think the ways that we learn about emotions is sometimes singular, but then the commonalities that they share amongst each other, it's like this is an intersectional diagram, right? Like these are all crossroads of different emotions that we experience. I'm curious to know, why did it take so long to create this diagram? Not for you, but why isn't that these models weren't being implemented earlier?
That's a very good question. I've been wondering about that myself also. Partly I think it's explained by the difficulty of climate matters, environmental matters, or the intersectional elements, that it often causes people to try to keep a problematic distance away from that. And that has resulted in people not talking about the emotional side either, even though that's so evident. And we've seen increase in research about climate emotions only during the last 8 years. Some pioneers were doing that already before. So it's relatively new. And then emotion wheels are an old method in psychology. And now it happened that this became intertwined. And I hope it had happened earlier, but I'm glad that it exists now.
Yeah, and do you think that psychologists and even therapists would be using this in the future, like ecotherapists, for example?
We've gotten very encouraging feedback with the Climate Mental Health Network from therapists who say that they are now integrating it in their therapy sessions, and the American Psychological Association, some folks said that they might include it in future training materials and that sort of thing. So even though it's relatively simple, it seems to be having a lot of impact, and of course we are very glad about that.
Yeah, I think from a psychology but also mental health side, this is such a grassroots model for me, because I know that there's recently an article I read a year ago or during our wildfire season in America, and there's an article talking about how therapists were reporting an increase of patients wanting to talk about eco-anxiety. And I think that this kind of can give leeway to many therapists who are not really climate experts, but are mental health experts to connect the missing dots in this issue.
Yeah, we really hope so. And I'm co-hosting a podcast called Climate Change and Happiness with environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty, who has been a pioneer in this field for a long time. And he's been using emotion word lists in his practice. So that's something that some therapists have been doing. And it's challenging for therapists also sometimes to be in touch with their own ecological grief or climate sadness, for example. So that's one recognized challenge, that how okay are the therapeutic persons themselves with eco-emotions and climate emotions. But luckily there's more and more people working also on that area and providing peer support.
Absolutely, and I think we always need more eco-psychologists out there, because we need people to provide these mental health services that are professionals. And using this diagram, whether you're a student, whether you're a scholar, professor, an expert in the industry, that we continue to reference these models as starting points for a lot of people.
Exactly, and using them in community, so that's very important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We finally left the classroom after learning more about diagrams and climate emotions, but now we are somewhere where most people already see and have experienced nature for itself, the outdoors. And Finland is known to have one of the most happiest people in the world. And I'm very curious to see, from an American perspective myself, is this study true? But two, what does a well-being system look like?
When Finns read the results of many surveys which have shown that Finland would be the happiest people in the world, we often think that how unhappy are the rest of the people in the world. But it's true that there's a lot of things which have been really good around here. And it's not just a coincidence. There's people who have been working in the public sphere for decades for that. For example, starting from the late 19th century and all over the 20th century, and gotten rights to many folks and developed the so-called welfare state system. So from the point of view of a Finn, it's ambiguous, because on one hand we have lots of good things around here, and we just walked through the Audi library of City of Helsinki, which is marvelous, a sort of community place and serves reading, of course, and education, but many other kinds of purposes also. So there are the good things, and at the same time, for the last 25 years, there's been budget cuts to education and healthcare. So the everyday experience of Finns is that things are sort of slightly getting into crisis. So it's ambiguous, but still wanting to testify, as we can see, that there's a lot of happiness around.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because from an American perspective, this is my first time being in Finland, so being a little bit biased here, is that the amount of third spaces that are available for people. I know that we just toured the library, and it didn't really seem like a library. It seemed very like a mall, I would say, but a very creative space where it's no sense of hierarchies, but rather an open space for people to come and learn. And I think that if America really reframed itself in the ways that we provide public services to our people, and perhaps abandoned these words like, is this actually a library, but more of a community center, it would help build this type of resiliency and understanding for people to feel the need to rely on this service versus seeing it as a poor thing to do or something that's not needed for their lives.
Yeah, in Finland and the Nordic countries, we really don't have a lot of community centers, but the library has been one of them, so it's a standard feature. And it's linked to high levels of literacy and reading skills, and also to some fundamental values in these societies. And one of them includes that everybody should have the opportunity to pursue education. And university education has been very cheap, almost completely free, for example. So that's one of the things which I think has really increased well-being and happiness around here.
When you say that, it makes me think the ways in which governments often lie to their people, of saying it's too expensive to do this, yet they invest millions of dollars in either war, violence, and brutal policies that hurt other people. And I think for me, like I'm always invested in knowing more about the ways in which we can actually build community resiliency, because I think there's one thing to say that governments need to, yes, uphold the ways in which they're helping its people and society, but also for people who may not have community, for example, or know much about the government, how do we talk about community resiliency for people who may feel disconnected already in the age of climate crisis?
In the 2021 large international study we did on young people's climate emotions and attitudes and experiences, a lot of them felt betrayed by the world's governments in relation to climate politics. And that's something that climate psychotherapists like Caroline Hickman, who was leading that study, or Sally Weintraub, have been discussing and writing about, that the feeling that the leaders are betraying people, that may be quite a fundamental source of anxiety also. So that's quite a crucial thing, I think.
I know that we have a housing crisis, a mental health crisis, like food crisis. All of these intersecting issues become a heavy burden for young people. So, for people who may not be in politics or in governmental roles, like how do we continue to mobilize while understanding that our current political democracies do not really reflect what younger generations want?
Yeah, that's a big question. And this idea of community resilience and transformational resilience, as for example, environmental psychologist and sustainability expert Bob Doppelt puts it, I think that's quite crucial, and in those frameworks the individual and community are so intertwined. So learning skills, how to deal with adversities both individually and collectively, I think is hugely important, and the practicalities of this may be quite different in different contexts also. So there's a need for openness, but simply just skills of learning to calm down your nervous system, I think may be very much in demand in the future. That's linked to the more direct impacts of climate change also, and it can help in the human conflict or tensions, because that's of course one of the worries that if there is more of that tension, then cooperation in communities will be increasingly difficult.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And I think, when we talk about the concepts around resiliency, it goes back to the ways in which the psychological field described resiliency and how the ecological side describes resiliency. And it was both found that the ways that psychologists or mental health experts define resiliency and environmentalists describe resiliency, it goes back to the human relationship of ecosystems, of recognizing the people around you, the species that exist rely on each other, versus an individual lens of only the superior species will move forward. And I think that's something where I think we can learn a lot from. And my question is, the realities of this industry, right? We may be here right now at a park and enjoying these like beautiful spaces, yet I can't stop thinking about the ways in which people today that are fighting for the planet don't necessarily have a guaranteed future like this. And my question to you, maybe this is more personal, is it viable for people to be working in the environmental industry? And not in terms of economic profit, but in terms of our well-being?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and for me it goes back to the dynamics of meaning and values and those deep things which can guide our lives. So I think it's so fundamentally important that we together keep working for a better world, even though we cannot know whether we can succeed. Some folks like to describe this with the concept of radical hope coming from Jonathan Lear, and other people use other framings. So that's one aspect to this very big question, but I think that increasingly we will need attention to those psychosocial skills related to well-being, so that people can continue doing that. So the themes of being open about vulnerabilities and practicing compassion and self-compassion, which you have also covered a lot in your work, I think that's quite essential.
What advice would you give to young people to apply the climate emotions work that you've done?
One starting point could be just to think about the role of emotions and feelings in our lives in general. and sort of being open to realizing that what emotional energies are present in my life in a given situation. For example, learning more about varieties of anger and how to work with them. That helps also in other conflicts and disagreements, not just with climate demonstrations. And sometimes during our work days we have to down-regulate emotion. For example, it's not always possible to go into experiencing the sadness about what's going on in the world. But then if that lives in our body minds, it would be important to connect with that perhaps after the work day. For example, lighting a candle or doing something else, so that you don't just skip it or escape from it, but you learn to engage with it. And sometimes upregulating the emotional energy and realizing that, hey, in this situation there's an injustice, I have my rights or our rights as a group, perhaps we should do something about this. So it's sort of upregulating the moral outrage instead of just thinking that, okay, now we have to suffer from the situation. But realizing that people's contexts are very different.
I love that framework of have your toolbox ready or your toolkit, because I think there's different ways in which our embodiments of actions reflect that. And you made me really realize is that even with myself, like in doing this work in environmental work, is that I have not given those other emotions of care to myself. And I think I've invested so much in caring for others that I forget to care about myself or the injustices that have happened. And I felt that personally through this conversation we're having, you've opened my eyes to think like I have not taken a single break since the last few years. And I think that's really has shown up now in my life of having to act a certain way, having to operate in certain ways, but then you telling me this, remembering all the things I used to do that were never forgotten, like doing foraging has always been an existent part of me, being able to sew, being able to call my friend and like not talk about work. I think those are the most easiest things and tangible things that are accessible for the human person that may not understand much about climate change but wants to do something. You know, individuals have that power to continue extending themselves as long as it's within your boundaries, within the limits of care that you can provide.
It's so easy to have a sort of utilitarian view, I mean, that, you know, thinking about what can we achieve and what do we need to do.
Yeah.
And if we still have that mindset, we can think about that we are not even doing the sustainability work as well as we can if we don't rest, because we will shrink from the pressures at some point. But I think that just fundamentally everybody should have the right to take enough breaks.
You know, with the model that you showed me earlier, it can be cyclical in some ways, right? I think that as you get older, too, I've been noticing that I've been in stages of the unknown, of being curious, of wanting to relearn something and unlearn older things while also maintaining the wisdom that I've carried over through the years. So I think that adults are very susceptible of repeating things, but having the opportunity to repeat those things for better choices. I think this goes back to of older versus younger generation. There's always this framing of older generations not doing enough, younger generations are doing more. And so how do we really find that balance of intergenerational resiliency to know that my work only exists because your work continues to exist? And how do we open access to that versus seeing it as a hierarchy?
Exactly, and that reminds me of what Joanna Macy calls connecting with the pain of the world. So that it's not individual, but realizing that it resonates in this web of interconnectedness and all the relations. And for different people, the framings may be different, sometimes talking about difficult emotions in relation to future or the state of the world. That might be better for communication than starting by using words like climate emotions with your grandfather if you use slightly stereotypical things. And also in Finland we've noticed that also older people have very profound ecological emotions, but they may not have the tools to put them into words or the social places where to talk about them. And that's also, I think, why we need to resist these framings that, for example, climate anxiety would be only a thing for the young people. that causes suffering both to the young and people of other ages.
It discredits all the older people who have also been working for it, and I think this is where we have to understand, like, paying attention to both the language and the embodiments of actions, because some people can embody those actions but don't know the right words. Some people know the right words but don't know the actions.
Yeah, that's very, very important, and that's why arts and creative methods can also be so important. So even though I'm speaking and writing a lot about the usefulness of learning to name emotions, but what's really fundamentally important is that you are able to connect and engage with them. And for some people it might be, dancing or some other thing, and that's already very, very important. So I don't want to give the impression in any way that it's just the naming or that's the only important thing here.
And these conversations are always continuing. They're never ending.
Yeah.
There's no such thing of this is the cure or this is the solution. It's a part of the solution. It's a building block that we're doing. So I really appreciate this conversation we've
Likewise.
had, because it's opened my eyes to so much more of the dimensions around earth-based emotions, and specifically climate-based emotion models that you've created, and how we can actually use it to provide local forms of healing and resiliency. Well, thank you so much, Panu, for joining me here and inviting me to your home here in Finland. I think that coming away from this country, but also your work, is that climate emotions exist on the spectrum, and that they don't just exist in singular dimensions, and that they are interconnected to the world. So thank you again for everything.
You are most welcome, and it's been such a pleasure to engage in these deep discussions with you.